The tension in that kitchen could have been cut with a knife, all because of a spilled glass of water. But for Jessica, that was the last straw. She approached her mother, her face inches from hers, and with a chilling coldness, whispered the words that would change everything forever. "Get out of here. Now. You're the worst mother ever." The door slammed shut. Thrown out of her home, humiliated, and with nowhere to go in the cold night, Sarah had only one last hope, a door she hadn't knocked on in a long time. But she didn't imagine that, upon ringing that doorbell, she would find not only shelter, but a family secret kept for over 40 years, and a note that would reveal the whole truth. Tell me where you're watching this story from, and if you enjoy stories inspired by real-life events and as moving as this one, subscribe to the channel to help us grow. The air in the small brick house in Hampton, Baltimore, was heavy, almost unbreathable. Sarah O'Connell, a 64-year-old woman with pale skin, weathered by time and gray hair that had once been blonde, felt a chill that didn't come from the January snow outside. Her tired blue eyes were fixed on her 38-year-old daughter, Jessica. Jessica paced around the kitchen with a restrained fury, her body as rigid as an ice statue. The sound of the knife striking the cutting board was their only conversation, each blow a punctuation mark in the hostile silence that filled the room. The house, once a home filled with laughter, now felt like an emotional minefield. Sarah had lived there since her husband passed away, a tolerated presence in her daughter's life. She depended on Jessica for almost everything. Her meager pension barely covered the medication for the high blood pressure and arthritis that stiffened her hands. This dependence was an invisible chain, and Jessica seemed to resent every link. Sarah watched her daughter's tense shoulders, her clenched jaw, and wondered where she had gone wrong, when the sweet, bright-eyed girl had transformed into that bitter woman. She tried, as she always tried, to fill the void with words, a fragile attempt to rebuild a bridge that crumbled day by day. "It smells great, darling. Is it that recipe from your aunt?" The question hung in the air, awkward and powerless. Jessica didn't turn around. She only let out a guttural sound, a grunt of contempt that hit Sarah harder than a scream. It was confirmation of what she already knew. Her presence there was a nuisance, a constant reminder of something her daughter hated. Sarah shrank into her kitchen chair, feeling small and invisible. She looked at her own hands, stained with age, and remembered when they were strong, able to mend broken toys and stroke children's hair. Now they trembled slightly, a sign of the anxiety that lived in her chest. The tension in the house was a reflection of the tension in her own body. Each day was a walk on eggshells, an effort not to say or do anything that might ignite Jessica's short fuse. The Hampton neighborhood, with its working-class houses and a once strong sense of community, seemed a world apart from the island of isolation in which they lived. Outside, people decorated their balconies, chatted on the sidewalks. Inside, the silence was a weapon. Sarah missed talking, laughing, simply existing without feeling like she was occupying a space that wasn't hers. Loneliness as a couple was the cruelest of all, a constant companion that reminded her of everything she had lost. Jessica finally turned around, placing a plate on the table with unnecessary force. Her eyes, identical to Sarah's but devoid of any warmth, coldly assessed her. There was no love there, not even anger. There was a terrifying emptiness, a profound weariness that seemed to have settled into her soul. Sarah felt a chill run down her spine. This was not her daughter. It was a stranger wearing Jessica's face, a guardian of resentments that Sarah couldn't decipher. She thought about her past, the sacrifices she had made, the sleepless nights she had spent. She raised her children practically alone after her husband fell ill. She worked 2 jobs, cleaning the houses of wealthy people so that they would lack nothing. She gave them everything she could, her time, her energy, her love. And now, all she received in return was that cutting silence, that empty gaze that made her question every decision she had ever made in her life. The food was served. They ate without exchanging a word. The only sound was the clinking of cutlery against the plates. For Sarah, each bite was difficult to swallow, a lump forming in her throat. She wanted to scream, to ask what had happened to them, why love had turned into tolerance and tolerance into contempt. But she knew that any word she spoke would be used against her. Another brick in the wall that separated them. Jessica stood up abruptly, her plate still half-eaten. She walked to the sink and turned on the tap, the sound of running water filling the silence. Sarah watched her, her heart pounding. She sensed that something was about to happen, that the thin layer of ice beneath her feet was about to break. The atmosphere was heavy, electric, like the air before a violent summer storm. The quiet was merely a facade, a dam holding back a torrent of emotions about to overflow. Sarah felt it in her bones, a premonition that left her breathless. She didn't know it, but a simple, clumsy movement of her hand was about to unleash the avalanche, a gesture so small it would change her life forever. That clumsy gesture was reaching for a glass of water. Sarah's hands, stiff with arthritis and trembling with tension, bumped against the glass. The glass tipped over, spilling a trickle of water onto the old wooden table. It was a banal accident, a small slip, but for Jessica, it was like a spark in a powder keg. Her eyes fixed on the puddle of water, and something inside her finally broke. The cold calm vanished, giving way to a fury that came from a very deep and dark place. "Can't you do anything right?" The question was a venomous hiss. Jessica's fists clenched at her sides, her knuckles white. Sarah, startled by the sudden outburst, began to apologize, grabbing a dishcloth. "I'm sorry, dear. It was an accident. I'll clean it up." But her words were cut short by a torrent of bitterness that left her paralyzed, the dishcloth forgotten in her hand. "I can't take this anymore." Jessica's voice rose, gaining strength, echoing through the small kitchen. "I can't stand you being here anymore, reminding me of everything that went wrong in my life." Each word was an accusation, a sentence. Sarah took a step back, as if she had been physically struck. She looked at her daughter's face, now red and contorted with anger, and saw years of accumulated resentment surfacing. She felt like an intruder, a stranger in a place that had once been her safe haven. The kitchen, where she had taught Jessica to cook, where they had celebrated birthdays and comforted broken hearts, was now a courtroom, and she was the defendant, guilty of crimes she didn't even understand. The pain on Jessica's face was as palpable as the anger, an ancient pain that frightened Sarah more than the screams. "You ruined everything," Jessica continued, her voice choked with emotion. "Ever since you moved here, my life has become a living hell. I have no peace, no space. I look at you, and all I see is failure. My failure." The words were cruel, unfair, but they came out with the conviction of absolute truth. Sarah felt tears burning her eyes, but refused to cry in front of her. She thought about everything she had given up. After becoming a widow, she sold her own much larger and more comfortable house to give the money to Jessica and her then-husband so they could make a down payment on a business. The business failed. The husband left, and Jessica blamed everyone but herself. Sarah, with what little she had left, ended up moving in with her. A solution that was supposed to be temporary but dragged on for years. Now, she was the scapegoat for all her daughter's frustrations. It was easier to blame her elderly and dependent mother than to face her own mistakes. Sarah saw this with painful clarity. She was a mirror, and Jessica hated the image she saw reflected. The image of a life that hadn't worked out, of dreams that had turned to dust. Jessica's outburst wasn't just about the glass of water, it was about the overdue rent, the dead-end job at a diner, the loneliness that consumed her every night. It was about the inequality she felt when compared to her older brother, Mark, the successful lawyer, and Sarah, with her quiet, worried presence, was the easiest target for all that pain. Sarah remained silent, absorbing each word like a blow. She had no strength to defend herself, to argue. What could she say? Any attempt to justify herself would only add fuel to the fire. She simply stood there, a small, cowering figure, while her daughter's storm of rage raged over her, destroying the last vestiges of her dignity. The energy in the room shifted. Jessica's anger transformed into a cold, terrifying determination. She stopped screaming, and the silence that followed was even more chilling. She took a deep breath, and with a calmness that chilled Sarah's blood, she approached her mother, her gaze fixed, the decision already made in her mind. Sarah felt the ground disappear beneath her feet, knowing that the next sentence to come out of her daughter's mouth would be the final blow. "Get out of here." The phrase was uttered in a whisper, but the impact was like a bomb exploding in the silence of the kitchen. Sarah looked at Jessica's face, a face she knew better than her own, and found nothing. No trace of the girl she had rocked to sleep, no vestige of the teenager with whom she had shared secrets. Just a stranger with cold blue eyes, full of ruthless resolve. "What?" Sarah managed to stammer, her voice a whisper. Jessica moved closer, the space between them narrowing until it became suffocating. The smell of her daughter's cheap perfume mixed with the greasy smell of dinner filled Sarah's nostrils. "I told you to leave, now." Jessica's voice was low, controlled, which made it even more cruel. And then, she uttered the words that would break Sarah's heart into 1,000 pieces, the words that would echo in her mind forever. "You're the worst mother there is." Worst mother that exists. The 4 words were like 4 nails driven into her chest. Sarah felt breathless, a sharp, physical pain spreading through her body. There was no arguing with it. It was a verdict, final and absolute. Jessica's gaze didn't waver. It was the look of someone who had finally said aloud what she had kept in her heart for years, and the relief on her face was the most monstrous thing Sarah had ever seen. There was no more discussion. What more could be said? Sarah turned, moving like an automaton. Her feet carried her to the small coat rack near the door. She picked up her woolen coat, already worn at the elbows, and her synthetic leather bag, where she kept her documents, the few dollars she had, and a bottle of heart pills. Each movement was slow, deliberate, as if she were moving underwater. She didn't look back, but she felt Jessica's gaze burning into her back. It was a look of triumph, of liberation. For Jessica, this was the end of a burden. For Sarah, it was the end of her world. The house, which had once represented safety, was now enemy territory from which she was being expelled. Her daughter, who had been the center of her life, was now her executioner. As she opened the door, a blast of icy air hit her face, mingling with the silent tears that finally began to fall. She made no sound, no sob. It was a silent pain, too deep to be expressed. She stepped outside into the cold Baltimore night, leaving behind the only home she knew, the only family she thought she had. The door slammed shut behind her with a sharp, definitive click. The sound sealed her fate. She was alone. Humiliation weighed heavily on her shoulders, heavier than the thin coat that barely protected her from the cold. She felt naked, exposed, stripped of her identity. She was no longer a mother, no longer part of a family. She was just an old woman, on the street, in the middle of the night. She looked out the kitchen window, at Jessica's silhouette moving inside. For a moment, a part of her hoped the door would open again, that her daughter would run after her, repentant. But the door remained closed. The kitchen light was a warm, welcoming glow that was now denied to her. That glow represented everything she had just lost. Sarah turned and began to walk aimlessly. Jessica's words hammered in her head, synchronized with her slow steps in the snow. Worst mother, worst mother. worst mother. The phrase became a mantra of self-loathing. Maybe Jessica was right. Maybe she was a failure, a toxic presence. The doubt, planted by her daughter's cruelty, began to take root in her soul. The humiliation was so intense that she barely felt the biting cold. It was an internal burning, a shame that consumed her completely. She, who had always prided herself on her resilience, on her ability to care for others, was now the one who needed care, the one who had been discarded. The role reversal was brutal, a cruel twist of fate that left her completely disoriented and adrift. The click of the door closing was the loneliest sound Sarah had ever heard. It marked the end of one chapter and the beginning of a terrifying exile. The frigid Baltimore air enveloped her like a shroud, and the tears that streamed down her face froze on her wrinkled cheeks. The Christmas lights, still twinkling on some balconies in the Hampton neighborhood, seemed to mock her misery. Small sparks of joy in a world that had suddenly become dark and hostile to her. She began to walk aimlessly. Her feet, shod in old shoes ill-suited for the snow, sank into the soft, white layer covering the sidewalk. Each step was a monumental effort, not only because of the cold, but because of the weight of the humiliation she carried. She felt like trash thrown on the street, something unwanted and disposable. The image of herself, a 64-year-old woman, wandering alone at night, was the personification of failure. Where to go? The question echoed in the emptiness of her mind. She had nowhere to go. Her Social Security check was a paltry sum, deposited directly into the joint account she shared with Jessica, an account from which she would never see another penny. The little money she had in her purse wouldn't last more than a day or two. The idea of a public shelter filled her with dread, the smell of disinfectant, the fear of having her few belongings stolen, the sound of strangers coughing in the darkness. She continued walking, passing houses with illuminated windows. In one of them, she saw a family gathered in the living room, laughing in front of the television. The scene, so normal and everyday, felt like a stab in her heart. This was a world to which she no longer belonged. She was an outcast, a spectator of others' happiness, separated from them by a glass wall and an abyss of pain. The cold began to seep into her bones. Her fingers were numb, and she could barely feel her face. She hugged herself, trying to generate some warmth, but the cold that consumed her was internal, a chill born of loneliness and despair. She thought about calling a friend, but which friend? The few she had were acquaintances of Jessica's, and she couldn't bear the shame of telling her what had happened. Disbelief still struggled against the harsh reality. Part of her refused to accept that her own daughter had thrown her out of the house in the middle of a winter night. It was such extreme cruelty, so inhumane, that it seemed like something out of a nightmare. But the snow on her shoes and the biting wind on her face were real. This wasn't a bad dream she would wake up from. She stopped under a street lamp, the snow falling around her like sad confetti. She opened her purse with trembling hands and counted the money. $47. It wasn't enough for a hotel room, maybe for a night in a cheap, dirty boarding house. The humiliation of having to ask for a room, of being seen as homeless, was almost unbearable. It was then that a single, desperate option appeared in her mind. A last refuge, a possibility she hesitated to consider. It was a shot in the dark, a risky gamble that could result in even more rejection and pain. But it was the only door left to her. The house of her eldest son, Mark O'Connell. The idea filled her with shame. Mark, the successful lawyer, with his perfect life in a wealthy suburb. Appearing at her door in that state, a pathetic and defeated figure, was the last thing she wanted. Mark had always been more distant, more pragmatic. He loved her, she believed, but in a restrained, responsible way. Asking for his help would be admitting her total failure, not only as Jessica's mother, but as a person incapable of managing her own life. Shame paralyzed her for a moment. But the cold was a powerful argument. The night was growing darker, colder, Survival spoke louder than pride. She had to try. With a resolve born of pure desperation, she headed for the nearest bus stop, her son's name echoing in her mind like a fragile prayer. The long, uncertain journey to the other side of town was about to begin. With the crumpled $47 in her hand, Sarah paid the bus fare. The stifling heat of the vehicle was a momentary relief for her frozen body. She sat in one of the plastic seats near the window and watched the lights of Baltimore pass by, blurred by her tears. The trip toward Towson, an affluent suburb north of the city, felt like a journey to another planet, not just another neighborhood. As the bus pulled away from the narrow streets and brick houses of Hampton, the scenery changed dramatically. The modest dwellings gave way to larger houses, set back from the street, with expansive lawns now covered by an immaculate white carpet of snow. It was the world of his son, Mark O'Connell, a world of success and stability that seemed to mock his own precarious situation. Mark Yee at 42 was the image of American success, a lawyer at a prestigious firm, married to Brenda, an equally successful woman, and father of a teenager. His life was organized, planned, a stark contrast to the chaos of Jessica's life and, now, to Sarah's helplessness. She felt like a stain about to tarnish the perfect picture of his life. With each kilometer the bus traveled, Sarah's anxiety grew. How would she explain her unexpected arrival in the middle of the night? What would she say? "I was kicked out by your sister." The words sounded pathetic in her mind. Mark had always been pragmatic, a problem solver. She didn't want to be another problem for him to solve, a burden to manage. She remembered Mark as a child, a serious and studious boy who rarely gave her trouble. He always seemed older than he was, taking on responsibilities from a young age. He respected her, called on holidays, sent a birthday card, but there was an emotional distance between them, a formality that never completely disappeared, even after all these years. Asking him for help was the ultimate admission of her failure. It meant that not only had she failed Jessica, but that now her failure was overflowing and affecting the stable life of her other child. The shame was a bitter taste in her mouth. She almost wished the bus would break down, that something would prevent her from arriving, to postpone the moment of humiliation. The bus finally stopped at its destination. Sarah got off, and the cold air hit her again. The streets of Towson were silent, almost deserted. The houses were large, imposing, with warm lights shining in the windows. They seemed like fortresses of happiness and security. Everything she no longer had. She walked through blocks that seemed endless, following directions she knew by heart but rarely visited. She felt out of place, a shadowy figure in a privileged setting. The few cars that passed slowed down, their drivers glancing curiously at the elderly woman walking alone in the snow. Each glance felt like an accusation, heightening her sense of inadequacy and shame. She gripped the strap of her purse, the only object that connected her to her identity. Finally, she arrived. Mark's house was a colonial-style building, with white columns and a red door that seemed too cheerful for her mood. The lights were on. They were home. For a long moment, she stood on the sidewalk across the street, just staring. The temptation to turn around, to disappear into the night and face whatever fate had in store for her, was immense. But the image of Jessica's face, cold and cruel, and the echo of her words propelled her forward. She had no other choice. She crossed the street, her steps leaving dark marks in the virgin snow of the driveway. Each step was a battle against wounded pride. She climbed the porch steps, her heart pounding wildly against her ribs, and with a trembling hand, she prepared to ring the doorbell, not knowing if the door that would open would be one of refuge or yet another rejection. Sarah's gloved, trembling hand hovered over the doorbell button for an eternity. The sound seemed too loud, an intrusion into the peace of that perfect house. She took a deep breath, the icy air burning her lungs, and pressed the button. The chimes rang inside, melodic and soft, a brutal contrast to the storm in her chest. She waited, her heart in her throat, ready for the surprised and perhaps irritated look of her son Mark or her daughter-in-law, Brenda. The door opened, but neither of them appeared in the crack of light. It was her grandson, Liam O'Connell, a tall, thin 16-year-old boy with his father's tousled brown hair and a gaze that, unlike others in his family, was genuinely kind. He stared at her, his surprise quickly turning to concern at her condition. "Grandma, what happened? You're freezing." His words, filled with genuine concern, were the key that unlocked the floodgates. Liam didn't wait for an answer. He gently grasped her arm and pulled her into the warm entrance hall. The warmth enveloped her, and the contrast with the cold outside finally broke through Sarah's last barrier of self-control. She allowed herself to collapse. The tears, which had previously been silent and restrained, came in an uncontrollable torrent. Deep, painful sobs shook her small body, releasing hours of fear, humiliation, and pain. She couldn't speak, couldn't explain. She just cried, a cry of pure helplessness, while her teenage grandson supported her, holding her with a firmness that belied his age. He didn't ask questions, just held her, confused but present. Mark and Brenda came down the stairs, drawn by the sound. Mark's face hardened at the sight of his mother in that state. Brenda, his wife, maintained a neutral expression, difficult to decipher. "What's happening?" Mark asked, his voice tense, directed more at Liam than at Sarah. "She's freezing, Dad. I found her at the door," Liam replied protectively. Their arrival changed the atmosphere. Liam's genuine concern was replaced by Mark's tense practicality. They led her into the living room, sitting her on a soft leather sofa that seemed to engulf her. Brenda appeared with a cup of tea, which she placed on a small table. Sarah's hands trembled so much she couldn't hold the cup. Mark began to ask questions, but his voice had the tone of someone dealing with a business problem, not his own mother's grief. "What happened to Jessica? Did you two fight again?" Sarah couldn't repeat Jessica's words. The shame was too much. She only mumbled something about a disagreement, that she needed a place to stay for the night. The lie was flimsy, and she knew Mark didn't believe her, but he didn't insist. There was a weariness in his eyes, the weariness of someone who had seen this movie before. The toxic family dynamic was a burden he carried as well. Brenda, ever efficient, went upstairs to prepare the guest room. Mark made a call, then went off to the kitchen. Sarah didn't need to hear to know who he was talking to. The conversation was short and muffled. When he returned, his face was even more somber. He said nothing, but the silence was eloquent. He was caught between his sister and his mother, a reluctant mediator in a war he didn't start. Liam helped her up the stairs, supporting her with each step. He led her to the guest room, an impeccable and impersonal space decorated in shades of beige. It looked like a hotel room, not a family room. Liam gave her a sad smile. "Try to rest, Grandma. Things will seem better tomorrow." Sarah knew it was a lie, but she appreciated the gesture. Alone in the room, she sat on the edge of the perfectly made bed. The silence of the house was deafening, amplifying the echo of Jessica's words in her mind. "You're the worst mother there is." She looked around at that strange room and felt more alone than ever. She was a refugee, dependent on the reluctant charity of her son. The door opened, but it wasn't salvation. It was merely the anteroom to a new kind of pain. A pain that would reveal that the problem was much older and deeper than a simple mother-daughter quarrel. Mark and his wife, Brenda, were polite, but the distance between them was an invisible wall. They had put her in the guest room, a space that, though comfortable, felt cold and lifeless, like an expensive hotel room. Brenda offered her tea, and Mark vaguely inquired about what had happened, but his eyes were tired, as if he were dealing with a chronic, unsolvable problem. Sarah merely murmured that she had had a disagreement with Jessica, unable to utter the cruel words that had banished her into the cold night. Alone, she sat on the edge of the soft bed, the silence of the wealthy house amplifying the echo of Jessica's accusation. "You're the worst mother there is." The phrase ricocheted in her mind, each repetition more painful than the last. She looked at her own hands, wrinkled and stained by age, and an old memory, buried under decades of denial, emerged with overwhelming force. She remembered other hands, small and fragile, that she had once held. The image of an empty crib in a hospital room more than 40 years ago assaulted her. The pain of that loss, a pain she thought she had overcome, returned with brutal intensity. It was an old wound, never fully healed, a secret she carried in silence, a ghost that shaped her entire life in a way she didn't even fully understand. The guest room was luxurious, with Egyptian cotton sheets and a view of the snow-covered garden. But to Sarah, it felt like a cell. She felt imprisoned by her past, by her choices. Mark and Brenda's formal politeness was almost worse than Jessica's open anger. It was a polished tolerance, a familial obligation fulfilled with a silent sigh of resignation. The next morning, the smell of fresh coffee wafted up the stairs, but Sarah had no appetite. She stayed in bed, listening to the sounds of the house waking up. She heard Mark's muffled voice coming from downstairs. He was on the phone, and she knew, with a painful certainty, that it was Jessica on the other end of the line. She curled up under the covers, as if she could hide from the words. She couldn't understand everything, but fragments of the conversation reached her ears, sharp as shards of glass. Always the same story. She needs to understand the consequences. "We can't do this again, Jess." The phrase, "do this again," hit her hard. So, her presence there was a repetition, a pattern. She was a recurring problem, a burden passed from one child to another when it became too heavy. The conversation ended, and a heavy silence settled over the house. Sarah felt a knot forming in her stomach. She wasn't a mother seeking refuge. She was an unwanted package that had been returned to sender. The humiliation of the previous night deepened, transforming into a feeling of worthlessness. She belonged nowhere. Later, she heard light footsteps on the stairs. It was Liam, her grandson. He entered the room holding a tray with toast and a cup of coffee. He didn't have the tense caution of his parents. His smile was genuine, his eyes filled with a compassion that disarmed her. He sat in an armchair in the corner, creating a safe space for her in that strange environment. "Aunt Jess can be difficult," he said, with a maturity that surprised her. "But she's not doing well. Ever since Dad told her about, you know." He paused, realizing he might have said too much. "Told her what?" Sarah asked, her voice hoarse. Liam looked away, suddenly uncomfortable. "Oh, nothing. Old news." He changed the subject, but the seed of doubt had already been planted in Sarah's mind. There was a secret that Mark knew, that Jessica knew, and that, somehow, was at the heart of all that pain. Jessica's anger, Mark's distance, everything seemed connected to something that had happened in the past, something she was the only one unaware of. The memory of the empty crib returned, and for the first time, Sarah wondered if that ghost was more real than she imagined. She didn't know, but her grandson, in his innocence, had just given her the first piece of a devastating puzzle, a piece that would lead her to a box of old memories and to a truth that was hidden right under her nose. Liam's words, "old stuff," etched into Sarah's mind, echoing in the silence of the luxurious guest room. The conversation she'd overheard earlier, the fragments of Mark's call, now fit into a disturbing pattern. "We can't do this again, Jess." This wasn't about an old wives' quarrel. It was about a cycle, a ritual of pain that repeated itself, and she, Sarah, was the unwitting centerpiece. The humiliation of being a burden now mingled with the agony of being the cause of a problem she didn't even understand. She stood, her body stiff with tension, and went to the window. The snow-covered garden was an image of peace, a silent painting that mocked the war within her. Each falling snowflake seemed a reminder of her fragility. She wasn't just an elderly mother in distress, it was a chronic problem, a familiar illness that resurfaced from time to time. The realization was a new wound, deeper than Jessica's rejection, for it suggested a fundamental flaw in her own existence. The day dragged on, heavy and silent. Mark and Brenda left, leaving her alone in that house that seemed more like a mausoleum of secrets. The silence, instead of calming her, amplified her doubts. She was trying to connect the dots. The memory of the empty crib that haunted her, the inexplicable pain in Jessica's eyes, Mark's calculated distance, and now Liam's enigmatic conversation. Were they loose pieces of different puzzles, or did they form a single, terrible image that she refused to see? She felt like an investigator in her own tragedy. Why was Jessica's hatred so visceral? It wasn't just about money or frustration. It was a hatred that came from the soul, as if Sarah had stolen something precious from her, something vital. But what? She had given her whole life, her time, her youth. What more was there to give? The question hung in the air, unanswered, increasing her sense of powerlessness and confusion. Mark's house, with its sterile perfection, began to suffocate her. It was the house of a man who kept everything under control, especially his emotions. What if he kept the family secrets the same way, locked away to maintain the facade of normalcy? His distance wasn't just pragmatism, she realized. It was a wall, built brick by brick to contain a truth that threatened to destroy everything. A wave of loneliness hit her with physical force. She was surrounded by her family, but she had never felt so alone. It was as if everyone were watching a movie whose plot she alone didn't know. She was the only one in the dark, stumbling over emotional landmines she couldn't see. It felt like being an actress on a stage, forced to improvise in a play whose script she had never received. The afternoon began to fade, and the dim winter light painted long shadows in the room. Sarah neither ate nor drank. The hunger she felt was not for food, but for truth. The image of Liam's face, his compassionate gaze, was her only anchor. He was the only one who saw her as a person, not as a symptom of a family illness. He was the only crack in the wall of secrets. She remembered his words again, dissecting each syllable. Ever since Daddy told her about, Mark had told Jessica something. A revelation. The trigger. What truth could be so cataclysmic as to transform a daughter's love into pure hatred? What secret could poison a family from within, for decades, without them realizing it? The need to know was a fever that consumed her. The house was quiet, but Sarah's mind was a hurricane. She knew it was no use asking Mark. He would deflect with vague answers, keeping his fortress intact. The truth wouldn't be given away. It would have to be discovered. And a deep intuition, a certainty that came from the depths of her soul, told her that the key to that painful mystery was hidden somewhere in that silent house. The opportunity to find that key arose with the soft sound of the door opening. It was Liam, returning from school. He wasn't carrying a tray of food. In his hand, he held a piece of yellowed paper, folded with nervous precision. His young face was pale, his eyes heavy with the weight of a discovery. In that instant, Sarah knew that the world as she knew it was about to end. That piece of paper wasn't just a piece of paper. It was a detonator, and Liam, in his innocent search for connection, was about to light the fuse. He approached her, not as a grandson, but as a messenger of destiny, bringing a truth that had the power to destroy or to liberate. Sarah held her breath, feeling the ground disappear beneath her feet. Liam's hesitation was palpable. He knew he was about to cross a line, to break a pact of silence he didn't even fully understand. But the compassion in his eyes overcame the fear. He saw Sarah's pain, a pain he now understood to be much older and deeper than a simple family feud. He felt that the truth, however terrible, was the only possible cure. He sat on the edge of the bed, the paper still in his hand. "Grandma," he began, his voice low, I know I shouldn't have, but I was looking for old photos in the attic, and I found a box of my father's, with things from when he was a child." He paused, swallowing hard, as if the next words were difficult to pronounce. "And this was inside." Sarah simply nodded, unable to speak. Her heart pounded in her ears. She held out her hand, a silent invitation. Liam, with a sigh of resignation, handed her the paper. The touch of the old paper on her fingers was like an electric shock, a direct connection to a past she had forgotten, or perhaps had been forced to forget. She knew, even before unfolding it, that this document would change everything. It wasn't just curiosity that drove her, but a desperate need to understand her own life, to find meaning in the suffering that had defined her. That piece of paper held the key not only to Jessica's anger, but to her own lost identity. The conversation with Liam, though interrupted, left a trail of gunpowder in the air. "Old things." The phrase echoed, laden with a weight that Sarah felt in her bones. She spent the rest of the morning in a state of torpor, replaying the scene in her mind. Her grandson's hesitation, the averted gaze. He knew something Mark had told him, and that had transformed Jessica into a hate-filled stranger. The feeling of being alone in the dark was a form of torture, a labyrinth with no way out. She felt like a spectator of her own life, watching a family drama unfold whose motivations were completely unknown to her. Liam's kindness was a paradox. It was a comfort, but also a confirmation that there was something to grieve for. His compassion wasn't just for her current situation, it was for a past tragedy, an injustice of which she was the central victim, without even knowing it. Questions assailed her in waves. What secret could have such destructive power? She searched her memories, looking for an event, a conversation, a forgotten detail that could be the key. But her mind was a blank canvas. Her life, in her memory, was a linear narrative of sacrifice and love. She couldn't find the hidden chapter, the footnote that would explain the collapse of everything. The loneliness in the guest room was a physical presence. Sarah felt like a ghost, haunting a house that wasn't hers, trapped in a story that wasn't hers. She looked out the window and saw the world go on, indifferent to her pain. Cars passed, people walked, but her personal universe had imploded, reduced to the rubble of those words, "You're the worst mother there is." Liam was her only connection to humanity that day. He brought her lunch, which she barely touched. He tried to make conversation, to talk about school, about music. Sarah answered in monosyllables, her mind miles away. The urge to grab him, to beg him to tell her the truth, was immense. But she couldn't put her grandson in that position, forcing him to choose between loyalty to his father and compassion for his grandmother. Liam's maturity was disconcerting. He seemed to navigate the complexity of the situation with an intuition lacking in adults. He didn't judge her. He didn't blame her. He was simply there, his presence a silent testament that she wasn't crazy, that her pain was real. In his eyes, Sarah saw a sad wisdom, the wisdom of someone who knows the fracture in the heart of his own family. She wondered what it would be like growing up in that house, with a father so emotionally shielded and a mother obsessed with perfection. Perhaps Liam, in his own way, also felt like an outsider. Perhaps that was why he connected with her, recognizing a lonely soul. This silent affinity was the only thing keeping her from completely falling apart. As evening drew to a close, Sarah's anxiety grew as darkness approached. Mark and Brenda's return would mean the return of forced cordiality, of empty conversations that avoided the elephant in the room. She didn't know how much longer she could endure it. The uncertainty was an acid corroding her sanity. She needed an answer. She needed solid ground beneath her feet. Then the door opened again. It was Liam. His face was pale, his breath short. He wasn't carrying food. He was carrying a piece of paper. He approached her, not with the lightness of a teenager, but with the solemnity of someone carrying a relic or a sentence. He stopped in front of her, his hand outstretched. "Hey, Grandma, I found this," he whispered, his voice choked with emotion. "It was in a box of my father's old things. I shouldn't have read it, but I did, and I think you should read it too." He offered her the paper. Sarah looked at that simple, yellowed piece of paper and felt the world spin. She knew, with terrifying certainty, that she was about to read the obituary of the life she thought she had lived. That piece of paper wasn't a simple find. It was the result of a deliberate search. After their morning conversation, Liam, driven by a need to understand the pain he saw in his grandmother's eyes, went to the attic. He searched for the metal box where his father kept the few mementos of his childhood. He wasn't looking for toys or school reports. He was looking for an answer. He found the letter at the bottom of the box, under a faded baseball cap. As he read his father's childlike words, the puzzle came together in his mind. The constant arguments between his father and his Aunt Jessica, the inexplicable sadness he sometimes saw in his grandmother's eyes, it all made sense now. He felt guilty for invading his father's privacy, but the need to alleviate Sarah's suffering was greater. Now, there she was, her heart pounding against her ribs, unfolding the paper with fingers that barely obeyed. The handwriting was unmistakable. Mark's handwriting as a boy. The date, 1985, transported her back in time, and the first two words hit her like a punch to the gut. "Dear Grandma?" The confusion left her dizzy. Which grandmother? Her parents had been dead for a long time. She forced her eyes to continue, the child's words leaping off the page, each one a blow. "Mommy cries a lot when she thinks about you. Daddy said you're in a better place, but I wish you were here." Sarah's mind raced. Mommy cries. She remembered the nights of silent mourning for her sister. The other, Sarah, Mark, a small, observant boy, must have seen her tears and interpreted them in his own way. The letter continued, relentless. "Mom said you would have loved me very much and that your name was the same as hers, Sarah. I kept this picture of you that Mom hides under the bed. I know you're my grandmother and I miss you, even without knowing you." Attached with a rusty clip was the final proof, a small, faded photograph of a young woman with dark hair and blue eyes, smiling. Her sister's face. The air was stolen from her lungs. The room seemed to tilt. The truth, so monstrous and so obvious, exploded in her consciousness. Mark and Jessica, her children. They weren't her children. They never were. They were her dead sister's children. They were her nephews and nieces. And she, for more than 40 years, had lived a lie so profound that she herself had become part of it. The pain was immediate and total. It wasn't the pain of rejection, but the pain of the annihilation of her identity. The role of mother, which had defined her, which had been the basis of her existence, was a farce. She wasn't their mother. She was the aunt who took the place of the dead mother, a substitute, a shadow. The revelation wasn't just about them, it was about the life she never lived. She remembered the chaos after the accident, the overwhelming pain of her parents. She, at 17, faced with the responsibility of raising a 2-year-old and a newborn. The decision, made in a fog of grief, to rewrite history to protect them. Sarah, the sister, would symbolically die with the other Sarah, and in her place, Sarah, the mother, would be born. That pact of silence, an act of desperate love, had become her prison. She looked at Liam, whose face was wet with tears. He wasn't crying for her, the rejected grandmother. He was crying for the whole tragedy, for the young woman who died, for the children who grew up in a lie, and for the other young woman who sacrificed her life in vain. The letter in her hand was not merely a childhood secret, it was proof of a crime of love, perhaps, but a crime nonetheless, a crime against the truth, against the memory of her sister, and against the children she loved so much, and the sentence for that crime was being carried out now, decades later, in the form of the disintegration of her family and her own soul. The photograph in her hand trembled. Her sister's smile was a specter from the past, a reminder of all that had been lost. Sarah realized that she, too, had been frozen in time since that day. She hadn't lived her own life. She had lived an imitation, a continuation of her sister's life. The revelation wasn't just about the identity of her children. It was about the complete and utter loss of her own. She looked at the yellowed paper, at her son's innocent handwriting, and understood the depth of the fracture. Mark had known, or suspected, from the beginning. He had grown up with the weight of this half-truth, which explained his serious nature and his emotional distance. He wasn't just a responsible boy. He was the keeper of a secret he himself barely understood. The truth crashed down on Sarah like a slab of concrete, crushing the air from her lungs. The image of her sister, Sarah, smiling in the photo, was a ghost that now haunted every corner of her memory. The accident, the pain, the decision made in a whirlwind of grief for a broken family. She, a 17-year-old girl, agreeing to become the mother of her nephews, Mark and little Jessica, to give them a chance at normalcy. The sacrifice was absolute. She buried her youth, her college dreams, her very identity. Sarah, her sister, disappeared so that Sarah, her mother, could exist. It was an act of love so desperate and total that she herself ended up believing the charade. They thought they were doing the right thing, building a shield against the trauma of orphanhood, but the shield was made of glass. Now, looking at Mark's childhood letter, she saw the cracks that had always been there. "Mommy cries a lot when she thinks about you." She remembered the nights she cried silently, a private mourning for her sister, and Mark, a perceptive boy, must have witnessed it. He interpreted her pain as a mother's grief for the loss of her own mother, the grandmother he never knew, creating a family mythology to fill in the gaps. And Jessica's bitterness, once an enigma, was now a clear map of her pain. Mark, older, discovered the truth gradually, but Jessica, to whom the truth was brutally revealed, already an adult by Mark, as Liam had hinted, felt betrayed to her very soul. Her life, her identity, the woman she called mother, all revealed themselves to be a construct. The betrayal was monumental. The phrase, "You're the worst mother there is," took on its final, cruelest meaning. It wasn't an exaggerated outburst of anger. It was a literal denial, distorted by pain. "You're not my mother." Jessica's cruelty wasn't innate malice. It was the cry of a wounded child, the rage of a woman whose foundation had been ripped from beneath her feet. Sarah's sacrifice was seen not as love, but as the ultimate deception. A wave of compassion for Jessica washed over her, an empathy that physically ached. How must it have felt for her to discover that her story was a lie? That the feeling of displacement you may have always felt had a real and terrible origin? Jessica's resentment wasn't about money or failure. It was about an identity stolen from her, the loss of parents she never had the chance to know or mourn. And Mark, her serious and distant son. His distance wasn't coldness. It was a survival mechanism. He carried the weight of that secret for years, trying to protect both his surrogate mother and his younger sister. The responsibility he always demonstrated wasn't just a personality trait. It was forged in the fire of that family secret. He was the silent guardian of the lie, a role too heavy for a child. Sarah's pain transformed. Humiliation gave way to a complex and multifaceted grief. Grief for her sister, whose life was cut short. Grief for her nephews, who grew up in a web of deceit, and, for the first time, an acute grief for herself. Grief for the 17-year-old girl who was sacrificed on the altar of family love, a young woman whose dreams died along with her sister. She looked at Liam, who watched her with a sadness that mirrored her own. He, a third-generation descendant, was the only innocent one in that tragedy, the only one who saw the situation clearly. He didn't see a troubled grandmother or a liar. He saw a woman who had sacrificed herself and was now paying the ultimate price for it. He was a witness to the truth. The truth, however brutal, brought a strange liberation. She finally understood. The puzzle was complete, and the image it formed was that of a family tragedy, a trauma passed down through generations. The lie, created to protect, had become a poison, corroding the bonds it should have strengthened. Now, the wound was open for all to see. Suddenly, everything fell into place in a mosaic of pain. Jessica's anger wasn't about a glass of water. It was about the adult discovery that her entire life had been built on the quicksand of a lie. The woman who raised her, whom she loved and hated, wasn't her mother. The pain of this revelation was an earthquake that shattered her sense of identity, leaving only ruins and resentment. The phrase, "You're the worst mother there is," now echoed in Sarah's mind with terrible clarity. It wasn't an attack on her capacity to love or care. It was a denial of her legitimacy in the role she had assumed. To Jessica, in her grief, Sarah was an imposter. Sarah's sacrifice, an act of love born of desperation, was rewritten by betrayal as the ultimate deception, the lie that robbed her of her true parents. Mark, always more reserved, dealt with the truth differently. His childhood letter was proof that he felt the absence, the missing piece. He probably pieced together the fragments over the years, processing the truth with his pragmatic logic. But this truth also erected a wall between him and Sarah. How could he relate to her as a mother, knowing that she was his aunt, the guardian of the secret that defined his existence? Sarah realized that her family dynamic wasn't about success and failure. It was about two orphans dealing with the same trauma in opposite ways. Mark shielded himself with success and control, an attempt to order the chaos of his origins. Jessica, perhaps more vulnerable, crumbled under the weight of the truth, her anger an outward manifestation of her inner pain, her life a reflection of the fracture in her foundation. Sarah's pain had shifted. The burning sensation of humiliation had been extinguished by a profound grief, a pain that had lasted 45 years. She mourned not only Jessica's rejection, but the truth she herself had helped to bury. In trying to give them a mother, she had deprived them of the truth about their parents, about their own history. She had loved them, but her love was intertwined with deceit. She understood, with painful clarity, that love, by itself, is not enough. Love, when mixed with deceit, even with the best intentions, can become a slow poison. The lie that was created to protect them from the trauma of orphanhood ended up creating a different and perhaps more insidious trauma, that of betrayal by the person they trusted most. She looked at the photo of her sister, a young face frozen in time. Sarah tried to honor her memory, raising her children as best she knew how, but perhaps, in trying to replace her sister, she inadvertently erased her. By becoming their mother, she prevented Mark and Jessica from knowing the mother they truly had, even if only through shared stories and memories. A wave of compassion for Jessica overwhelmed her, drowning her own grief. She imagined her daughter's pain, the helpless rage of discovering that her life was a charade. Jessica's anger wasn't malice. It was the cry of a wounded child. A child who discovered too late that her entire reality was a carefully constructed illusion. The loneliness she felt now was the loneliness of carrying a secret for so long. She had isolated herself in her role, in her lie, and now, with the truth exposed, she was alone with the ruins of her life. But amidst the rubble, there was a seed of clarity. For the first time, she understood. She wasn't a terrible mother. She was an aunt who made an impossible decision when she was just a girl. She had made a mistake, a monumental one, but it was a mistake born of love and grief. And now, with the letter in her hand and the truth in her heart, she knew she could no longer hide. The next conversation she would have with Mark wouldn't be about a place to sleep. It would be about a lifetime of secrets, and the first step toward, perhaps, beginning to unravel them. The revelation freed her from the prison of unjust guilt. Jessica's accusation, which had crushed her, was now understandable. Not justifiable in its cruelty, but understandable in its origin. Sarah was not the villain in Jessica's story. She was a tragic character in the same play, both victims of a decision made long ago, in a moment of unimaginable pain. This new perspective didn't lessen her own pain, but transformed it. Shame gave way to a profound grief for all of them. For her sister, for Mark, for Jessica, and for the young woman she once was. It was a shared grief, even if the others didn't yet know it. The truth was common ground, albeit battle-ravaged ground. She looked at Liam, who was still watching her with silent concern. He, the grandson, the innocent one, was the one who handed her the key. He didn't judge her. He simply saw her pain and sought an answer. In his purity, he had done what the adults, fearful and full of secrets, had failed to do for decades. He brought the truth to light. The gratitude she felt for Liam was immense. He didn't just give her an answer, he gave her back a piece of her sanity. He validated her feelings, confirming that the fracture she felt in her family was real, not a figment of her old age or her sensitivity. He was her witness and her savior. With this newfound clarity, a resolve began to form within her. She couldn't change the past, she couldn't erase the lie, but she could face the truth now. She could stop hiding behind the role of mother and present herself as she truly was. Sarah O'Connell, the aunt who loved them enough to make a terrible mistake. With the letter in her hand, Sarah descended the stairs. Each step was a descent into a new reality. Her steps, once hesitant, were now firm, heavy with the gravity of truth. She was no longer a victim adrift. She was a woman seeking redemption, armed with proof of her crime of passion. The moment her feet touched the hall floor, the front door opened. Mark entered, bringing the cold of the night with him. He stopped, briefcase in one hand, keys in the other. His eyes went straight to the yellowed paper in her hand. The control on his face, his professional mask, cracked. He paled. "Where did you find this?" he asked, his voice strained, not that of a son, but of a lawyer whose key witness had unexpectedly appeared. The fortress he had built around himself was under siege. "Liam showed me." Sarah's voice came out clear, without trembling. It wasn't an accusation, it was a statement. She looked into the eyes of the man she raised, the nephew who called her mother, and saw through the layers of success and control. She saw the 11-year-old boy who wrote that letter, a lonely boy trying to understand the sadness in his home. "Mark, we need to talk." She stepped forward, bridging the physical and emotional distance between them. Not as mother and son. She paused, gathering all her courage to utter the word that would change everything. "But as the aunt who raised you and the nephew I love." The word aunt hung in the air, a strange and powerful sound, breaking decades of silence. Mark's face contorted. The mask slipped completely. His shoulders, usually straight and confident, slumped. The vulnerability he had spent his entire life suppressing surfaced in an overwhelming wave. In that instant, he didn't see her as a burden, a recurring family problem. He saw her for who she was, the 17-year-old girl who had given up everything so that he and his sister could have a life. Tears welled up in his eyes, not tears of pity, but of a deep, ancient pain. The tears of a boy who missed a mother he barely knew, the tears of a man who had carried the burden of a secret for too long. He dropped the briefcase, which fell to the floor with a dull thud, and took a step forward, enveloping her in a hug. It wasn't a formal hug, it was a desperate hug, the hug of a man who had finally allowed himself to break. Sarah hugged him back, feeling the tremor of his silent sobs. In that hug, 45 years of lies, of distance, of unspoken pain began to dissolve. It was a hug of recognition, of forgiveness, of a truth finally shared that was stronger than any lie. From the doorway, Brenda and Liam watched, their eyes brimming with tears. They were no longer spectators of a family drama. They were participants in a moment of healing. The hug didn't fix everything, but it was a start. It was the demolition of the false foundation so that a new one, based on truth, could be built. As they pulled away, Mark held her by the arms, as if to make sure she was real. "I'm sorry," he whispered, his voice hoarse. "I should have talked to you. I didn't know how. I'm so sorry for everything." The words were simple, but they carried the weight of a lifetime of regret. "I'm so sorry too, Mark," Sarah replied, her voice soft. "I thought I was doing the right thing. I was so young." They looked at each other, no longer as mother and son, but as two survivors of the same tragedy, finally meeting on the other side of the pain, in the devastated land of truth. The journey would be long and arduous. The conversation with Jessica would be the most difficult. But there, in the entrance hall, under the gaze of her family, Sarah felt a seismic shift. The humiliation had been washed away, replaced by a painful clarity. She was no longer alone in her secret. The truth, however terrible, had united them in a way that the lie never could. That hug was the first crack in the dam. The emotion Mark had suppressed his entire life finally found an outlet. He guided her to the sofa, sitting beside her, still holding her hand like a frightened child. Brenda brought water, her once efficient movements now gentle, filled with a newfound compassion. The air in the room was heavy, not with tension, but with a raw vulnerability. "I found out when I was about 16, Mark confessed, his voice low. "I found my mother's death certificate and her birth certificate. The dates didn't match. I confronted Grandpa. He told me everything." The confession explained the change in his behavior during adolescence, the deepening seriousness, the growing distance between him and Sarah. "I didn't tell Jessica. I thought I was protecting her," he continued, his face contorted with guilt. "But she was unhappy, always angry, always feeling like something was wrong. A few years ago, in a nasty fight, I threw the truth in her face. It was the worst thing I ever did." He buried his face in his hands, the infallible lawyer crumbling under the weight of his mistakes. Sarah placed her hand on his shoulder. "We all make mistakes, Mark. We were all trying to survive the best way we knew how." In that moment, she wasn't his aunt or his mother. She was just one person offering comfort to another, both caught in the same web of pain and love. That hug in the hallway wasn't a happy ending, but it was a true beginning. Reconciling with Jessica, as Mark had predicted, wouldn't be easy. It would require time, patience, family therapy, and many painful conversations. Jessica's wound was deep, fueled by years of a feeling of betrayal that now had a name and a face. But that night, at Mark's house, something fundamental had changed forever in Sarah's soul. She was no longer the worst mother in the world. She wasn't an imposter or a failure. She was Sarah O'Connell, a woman who, at 17, made an impossible decision, driven by love and desperation. She was a survivor who had carried the weight of 2 lives in addition to her own, and who was now, finally, beginning to free herself from the burden of the lie that had defined her. In the days that followed, the dynamic in Mark's house transformed. The tense formality gave way to a hesitant, awkward tenderness. Brenda, who had previously seen her as a problem for the O'Connell family, now looked at her with a new compassion and respect. She saw the strength of the woman who had sacrificed everything. The conversations at the dinner table were no longer superficial. They began to truly talk for the first time. Liam, with his natural empathy, became the bridge between generations. He spent hours with Sarah, not asking for stories about the mother she pretended to be, but about the sister she lost. He wanted to know about the other Sarah, her real grandmother. In doing so, he was helping to rescue a memory that had been suppressed, giving her grandmother the chance to mourn and celebrate the sister she never could. One afternoon, while leafing through an old photo album that Mark had rescued from the attic, Liam placed the small yet faded photo of his biological grandmother next to a recent photo of Sarah. He looked from one to the other, a sad smile on his lips. "I always wanted to meet my grandmother," he said softly. "But I think having you, the bravest great-aunt in the world, is even better." Liam's words were an epiphany for Sarah. In that moment, she understood that overcoming wasn't about erasing the past, but about integrating it. It was about accepting that the pain, the loss, and the humiliation were part of her story, but they weren't the end of it. They were the foundation upon which something new and true could be built. She didn't need to be a perfect mother. She could be a perfectly imperfect aunt. She realized that, in trying to be a substitute, she had become a one-dimensional figure. Now, with the truth exposed, she could be complex, flawed, human. She was the aunt who loved them fiercely, the sister who was still grieving, the woman with her own story of resilience. And in that complexity, there was a beauty and a strength that the lie had never allowed to flourish. The first family therapy session was scheduled. Jessica's voice on the phone was cold, distant, but she agreed to go. It was a small step, but in the right direction. Sarah knew she might never get back the daughter she thought she had, but there was a new hope: to build an honest relationship with the niece she had lost in grief. Sitting in Mark's living room, the winter sun warming her face, Sarah held Liam's hand. She was no longer a refugee. She was home, not in a brick house, but in a familiar space built on the fragile, yet powerful, foundation of truth. The pain still existed, but it no longer defined her. It was only a part of her story, not the whole story. Her journey was far from over, but she was no longer walking alone. She was surrounded by a new kind of family, one that was learning to navigate the waters of honesty. And upon the ruins of the past, they began to build, piece by piece, a future of forgiveness, acceptance, and a love that, finally, no longer needed secrets to survive. Healing wasn't an event, but a process. The therapy sessions were brutal. Jessica poured years of anger and pain onto Sarah and Mark. She accused them of stealing her identity, of lying, of betraying her. Sarah didn't defend herself. She listened. She absorbed her niece's pain, acknowledging the validity of her feelings, even when the words cut her like glass. Slowly, very slowly, the cracks in Jessica's armor began to appear. Behind the anger, there was a frightened and confused girl, grieving for parents she never knew and for a life she never had. She began to ask questions about her mother, the other Sarah, and Sarah, for the first time, was able to speak freely about her sister, sharing memories, stories, rescuing her from oblivion. One day, months later, Jessica showed up at Mark's house unannounced. She didn't say anything, just handed Sarah a small box. Inside was a framed photo of her mother, the same photo from Mark's letter. "I think this belongs to you," Jessica said, her voice low. It wasn't an apology, but it was a start. It was an acknowledgement of their shared history. Sarah's life found a new rhythm. She moved into a small apartment near Mark's house, financed by him. It was her own space. The first time in decades she had a place that was just hers. She decorated it with photos of her whole family: her sister, her parents, Mark, Jessica, Liam. The truth, in all its complicated forms, was now exposed on the walls. She and Jessica began meeting for coffee once a week. The conversations were often awkward, filled with silences, but they were trying. They were building a new bridge over the chasm that separated them, one plank at a time. And in one of those coffees, Jessica smiled. A small but genuine smile. And for Sarah, that smile was worth more than 1,000 words of forgiveness. And that was Sarah's journey. A story that shows us that sometimes the greatest sacrifices made for love can have the most painful consequences, but that the truth, however difficult it may be, is always the only path to healing. If you've made it this far, If this story touched you in any way, leave a comment below with the phrase, "The truth always finds a way." That way, I'll know you followed everything to the end. And if you want to help our channel in a more direct way, so that we can continue bringing you more stories like this, that make us reflect and move us, there's a link to contribute in the first pinned comment. Any help you can give is very important to me and to the growth of the channel, to spread more content like this around. But just the fact that you made it to the end of the video already helps a lot. And if you can, share this story with someone you think will also be moved. And don't leave yet. I've set aside a very special video for you right here on the screen. Click on it and we'll meet there.